In this lesson, we'll start to build up some of the components that connect the wing to the aircraft's main body. Okay, so now we have our scene that has been nice and cleaned up in our previous lesson. So what I'd like to do is take the portions where these wings actually connect into the main body of our aircraft and actually build sort of a little lip around those, very similar to the method that we used to create this lip around this pilot hole. Now I'm going to use a very similar technique to this, so I'm going to actually extrude the shape that we want along a curve. The problem is, though, that we actually need to create a curve that conforms to this wing shape. Not only does the curve need to conform to the wing shape, but it also needs to conform to the actual shape of this airplane's body. So it needs to be a very curved piece of geometry that we're actually going to use for this. Now, there's actually a very, very important reason that we built this wing as well as the main body out of a surface mesh. Because one of the unique things that we can do with a surface mesh is actually tell Softimage to generate a curve at any point where these two surfaces intersect each other. So this is something that we would not normally be able to do if we were working with a poly mesh. So that's, again, just one of the reasons that we have chosen to go this route. Now, before we actually attempt to build this, there is going to be a little bit of a problem that we run into, and that is with this aircraft main body. You can see that we have this blue curve that is running down the length of the aircraft. Now, this is essentially the seam in the geometry. So this is the point where the piece of geometry actually loops back around and then folds back to touch itself. So this seam is something that really has always been present in the geometry. It's just that by doing the trimming, which we did in one of our earlier lessons, it's now made this seam much more visible as far as the display goes. Now, the problem is that if I try to make a curve around this intersection, part of that curve extends past the seam of this geometry. It extends past that little blue line. So whenever it comes time to make this curve, we're going to run into some issues because the curve is trying to now span across two different pieces or two different ends of this aircraft body. So this is really not going to be a good place to attempt to do that. Now, another option would be to actually try to generate that curve over on this opposite side where you can see we actually don't have that same seam. So in order to do that, I need to take this piece of geometry and actually get it over here so that way we can have a good place to actually generate that curve. So if I just select this piece of the wing, we can go up to Edit, Duplicate, Instantiate, and all the way down to the bottom, we can choose the Mirror Duplicate Symmetry. There we are. So if we choose Duplicate Symmetry, all these options should be able to be left on by default. We want to set the symmetry plane to the YZ plane, which means it's going to flip it across the X axis. If you look down at our axis indicators, that's the axis that we want to flip it across. So hit OK. And now you can see that our wing is over on the opposite side. Now the wing geometry looks very, very dark, and that's completely normal. It just means that while this geometry has been flipped, it also was basically turned inside out. So this is really, really easy to fix in Softimage if we ever wind up with geometry that has this black outer appearance. Again, just means that that surface is essentially reversed or inside out. So to fix this, we'll just select the geometry, go to Modify Surface Mesh, and Invert Normals. There we are. Now you can see that wing is been flipped right side out. So now that we have this fixed, let's come in and start to generate this curve. So let's select these two pieces of geometry, the wing as well as the main body. With those two selected, we want to create a new curve. So let's go to Create Curve. And we want to create a curve where these surfaces intersect. Now, looking at this, initially you can see we have this curve, but it's really going nuts. It's going all over the place here. So we'll need to come in here and start to adjust some of these different parameters. So typically what I find to start to get some better results is we need to take this intersection tolerance and start to bring this down. And just to make this a little bit easier to see, I'll go up to my shaded and I'll turn on this X-ray. Now with the X-ray mode turned on, we can now actually see through any solid geometry and see any curves or anything that's underneath there. So this becomes really, really useful for actually being able to see this geometry. So what I'll do is take something like this intersection tolerance as well as the position tolerance and set both of these down really, really low, something like 0.001 for both of them. And in my case, you can see that actually looks like it's doing a pretty good job. If I were to press the T key on my keyboard, you can see that we do have this curve, but it's had to generate a lot of these points in order to get a proper curve. And that's okay, we can always come back and adjust this later. But for now, this gives us what we need, so we can go ahead and close out of that. So now we have our curve, and at this point we could use this curve for extrusion, very similar to what we did with our pilot hole up here. Again, the problem is, if I were to look at these points, there are a lot of points here, and this means I'm going to wind up with some really, really dense geometry. So again, I'm sort of a stickler for having nice, clean geometry, so if possible, I like to come in and fix this up. So very similar with what we did with our pilot hole up here, we can just select this curve, and let's build a new curve on top of it. So we'll go to Create Curve, and we'll use Fit on Curve. Okay, so again, if I were to come in and press the T key on my keyboard, you can see that now this new curve has only 10 points. And I can come in and start to adjust the number of subdivisions up or down until I find something that works. So it looks like in my case, something between 20 and 22 should work just fine. There's a little bit of a gap that you can see right back here in the back, but for the most part, this should work pretty well. So now that I have generated this new curve on top of this old dirty curve, what I could do is just delete that older dirty curve out of there since I don't need that anymore. And now we're left with this nice, clean, well-built curve. So now we're going to use, again, very similar techniques. So let's build ourselves another curve. We use a circle for this one. And again, we just move this up and out of the way so it's a little bit easier to grab. With this curve selected, we can now go to Create Surface Mesh, and we'll create a new surface mesh by extruding along a curve. Now we just need to pick the curve that we want to extrude along. And there we go. Again, this curve, or this circle that we used, is much, much too big. So we can come in and start to shrink down the size of that. Looks like something like 0.2 or 0.3 should work okay. Alright, and looking at this, we can tell it to close that in the V direction, so we can make sure that that is not some kind of an open surface, which you can tell it is right here where these different ends of the curve actually meet up and connect. So we can go ahead and tell Softimage to make that a nice closed curve. Okay. And now, looking at this, you can see we have a decent starting shape. Now we may need to come in here and actually grab this curve back here that's actually being used to generate this shape, and maybe do a little bit of reshaping on that ourselves. So looking up toward the front, looks pretty good, although I might want to grab a couple of these points and maybe just pull these straight forward. In my case, I'm going to switch myself to a global mode so I can make sure I just pull these nice and straight. Okay, very nice. And once again, just like what we did with our pilot recess here, we could always come in and grab that curve, this circle up here. If I were to press the Enter key on my keyboard, as well as the T key, you can see again we have a very, very high number of points in here by default. So just to make this a little bit easier to shape and curve, I like to come in and set this down to something much lower. Something like 8 tends to work much better, I find. And now we can come in, start to grab some of these different points in here, and then use those to start reshaping this little connection piece. So maybe just flattening that down very, very slightly, and just reshaping that really however we would like to have that look. Okay, very nice. And if we want to, again, just coming back and turning off that X-ray mode when we're finished working. All right, very good. So you can see now we have this really nice little connection piece that is joining the wing to the main body. And again, just like before, if we want to now get this over to the other side, we can select this, go to Edit, Duplicate Instantiate, and down toward the bottom, Duplicate Symmetry. All right, we'll go ahead and again leave everything set to default. And now here is this new piece of geometry that's been flipped over to the opposite side. Again, the geometry may turn inside out whenever we flip it, so we can just grab that, go to Surface Mesh, and then invert normals. Okay, so there's our little connection piece that will now provide a little bit more of a clean transition between the wing and this main aircraft body. So in our next lesson, we'll continue building up some of these additional pieces of our aircraft.